Good morning, church. Today is Tuesday, April 21st. Over the weekend, I was reminded of the story of Noah. It's always been one of my favorites, and I think it's been a favorite of a lot of people. Even from the time we were very small children, we loved the story of Noah and the ark. My wife, Carolyn, one time told me that she felt like Mrs. Noah. She had 3 sons, she was married to a preacher, and she lived in a zoo. I think that's pretty accurate on all accounts. But the story that we're going to talk about today is found in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. It would be mentioned several more times through Scripture, as a matter of fact, including the time in the writings of Peter, when he would make a likeness between that event of the cleansing of the world and likening that to the cleansing that we go through as we are baptized into Christ. Well, here's the story. The world had become very corrupt. Everywhere there was nothing but sin. God had had enough. He determined that he would start all over, but not quite from scratch, because Noah was a righteous man. And God would use this righteous man and his family upon whom to build the future of mankind. From the time that God announced that the flood would be coming until the flood actually happened was 120 years. And evidently Noah spent over 100 of those years in the construction of the ark itself. God had given him the blueprint, a pretty specific blueprint. It was to be 450 feet long, it was to be 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Interestingly, roughly the same ratio that modern ocean-going vessels have in their design. It was to have 3 decks. It was to be covered inside and out with pitch, obviously to waterproof the entire vessel. It was to have 1 door in the side, and it was to have 1 window 18 inches high, and I'm thinking maybe 18 inches high, but completely surrounding the top of the ark. God directed Noah at that time, as God directed also the animals to come to Noah. Aboard that boat would be 2 of every unclean animal, a male and a female. But there would also be 7 pairs of every clean animal. And then there was the day that they were finally all on board, and God closed the door. We don't know exactly what that looked like, but we know certainly it was before the days of hydraulics, and it was before the days of modern machinery. And we assume that that door was a fairly heavy door, and God closed it. You know, I wondered about the thoughts that went through the minds of those people, those 8 that were on board that day. And evidently they were all in agreement that this had to happen. But this had to be a hard decision, a hard moment for the sons, and particularly for the wives of the sons. And yet at that moment, when God closed the door, it was indeed a confirmation to them that God was with them, and that what they were about to experience was going to be able to be survived because they were in the hands of God. Well, the rains came, and the fountains of the deep burst forth. It rained for 40 days and for 40 nights, and the waters increased until the tallest mountains were covered, and then 22 feet more than that. You think that our isolation now is difficult? They were on board that boat for a year and 17 days. But they knew that they and they alone were safe of all the peoples of the world. And we don't know how many there were at that time. I have heard estimates that there were perhaps even 250,000 people population on the earth at that time. But they knew on board that boat at that time, they were the ones that were being saved, and that all others were lost, including, I might add, the families of the wives of those 3 sons. Well, there came that day, after they had been floating for months, after they had been enduring that time of amazing isolation. It had to be a hard time in many ways, and yet they knew that they alone were safe. But there came that day that they felt something that they hadn't felt. The boat touched land. Finally, the ark lodged itself on the land. The scripture tells us this occurred in the mountains of Ararat. This would be in far eastern Turkey today. But the boat lodged itself there, and the tops of the mountains became visible. Noah, after a while, sent out a dove, and the dove went out and flew here and there and came back because there was nowhere for it to nest. Noah waited 7 more days, and then he sent out the dove a second time, and this time the dove returned with an olive branch in its beak. Isn't that interesting? A sign of peace after the great storm. And then he waited 7 more days, and he sent out the dove again, and this time the dove didn't come back. God told Noah it was time to go out. And so we look at the great story, and we draw some lessons, and I think these are valid lessons for us to learn. That was a time of cleansing, a time of cleansing for the sins of the earth. But it was also a time of cleansing in the minds of each of those people. It was a time of reflection. I can only imagine, you can only imagine, what did they think about for all of those days on board that boat? What were their reflections, knowing that they were in the hands of God, knowing that everything was going to be placed in their hands to start all over again? It was a time of renewal. Certainly by the time they were allowed to get out of that boat and to walk onto dry land, I'm sure that they were ready for that to happen. And they were ready for a new life to begin. And it was interestingly a time of a new covenant. God gave them some directions, and in effect, he gave them some lessons to be learned. He told them to go out and to take control of the earth, of the plants, of creation. God wanted them to go out and to be in control of what was there. God promised them that there were plants that were for their food and that the animals were for their food. They were still in the care of God, but it was now time for them to go out and to take responsibility for the renewal of the human race. He told them to give new respect to every person. Now, this would go beyond their generation, but they were to view every person as a creation of God. God told them that he would display his might and his glory. And the rainbow was given as a sign for both God and man to remember that event and to remember this relationship that existed between mighty Creator God and the creation, mankind. The time of our getting to get out of our houses and to go about life is coming. We're not sure yet when that's going to be, but I know that we're all very anxious for that to happen. But when that happens, I hope we come to that time with some lessons learned and having grown closer to God, and actually during this time having grown closer to one another, even though we have been separated one from another. We see now in a whole new way the value of our relationship and the importance of our meeting together. And so when that time comes that we get to open our doors, we get to go out in the public, and most importantly, when we get to come back together again, I hope it is with a renewal that comes from God Himself. And so today, Christians, take a look at this day and let this day be a renewal in your life. Go and have a great day.